We can talk about tracking, which is one of the skills we train ourselves in for Hakomi. And it's really following what we're talking about with the practice of loving presence. I mentioned that one of the ways that we cultivate this state of mind called loving presence is to see something in the person that we're with or in the situation where we are that nourishes us. And then we open up and receive and take in that nourishment. And one of the ways to do that is to actually actively search for something in the other person that inspires us. One of our practices is called search for inspiration. And so when I'm teaching tracking, that's the first step, the very first thing that we're looking for. Tracking is observing the person that we're with, the client, if I'm being the Hakomi practitioner, for signs of present experience, for indicators, and we'll talk about that later, of how the person organizes experience. But the very first thing we're tracking for is what nourishes us and what inspires us. We're looking for those client factors that are going to be the basis of anything that's effective or successful for them in the whole process of Hakomi. So I'm searching and we'll call it tracking for their resources, their characteristics, their virtues, their beauty, their courage, the very things that are going to serve them well in life as well as in the Hakomi process. So that's the very first step in tracking, is to look for that. One of the things that happens when I'm seeing someone and seeing what's right, taking in their strengths and their beauty, is that I can relax as the helper, as the therapist or practitioner. I know that the person comes with everything that they need to move through this process and succeed. So I can relax. And then I can open up my tracking, my observation, to notice what's happening in present time, what seems to be happening, because of course I'm only guessing. But I'm looking next, after I have taken in signs of strengths and resources and the very things that inspire and nourish me. The next thing I'm tracking for are signs of the person's present experience. What's happening for them now? This is experience-based psychotherapy, actually moving into the realm of assisted self-discovery. And the present experience is what we're working with because it shows everything that we need about the person's history, the person's beliefs, the person's way of organizing their experience. And one of the ways that I follow up what I see or guess about the person's present experience is to, from time to time, contact that just with a word or two. Just let them know that I notice what's going on with them. And the third stage of tracking, starting with what nourishes me, what's inspiring to me. Secondly, signs of present experience. And thirdly is noticing what's happening that seems characteristic. These are indicators. What are the indicators of the way the person organizes their experience and reacts based on the models they hold of who they think they are, what kind of world they're living in, and how they need to survive in that world. We call these indicators, and that's the third thing that we're tracking for. And actually, we're tracking all three of those kinds of things: what's inspiring, what's happening now, and what might be indicators of their beliefs and habits. We're tracking all of those simultaneously. It's not sequential. So that's what tracking is about. So we talked about one of the things that we're tracking for is the signs of present experience, signs of the person's present experience, not just ways that they're organizing experience, because we're going to work with those, but what is actually happening right now. And it helps us to be in contact with the person actually energetically and visually, and we're using auditory. Tracking is not just watching the person, it's listening and feeling and sensing. And we want to get to a level that is recently being referred to as limbic resonance. Neuroscience talks about this, how we can actually resonate. Our limbic brains match up with another person's experience. And that's the best way to be in contact with the person that we're working with. And then we're tracking for signs of what might be happening for them. We can feel it in ourselves sometimes. We can hear it in their voice. We can see something visible in their expression, perhaps, or their body language. We're only guessing, and we can make some pretty accurate guesses, and we can let the person know that we have a sense of what's happening for them with a skill in Hakomi that we call contact statements. Verbal contact is a way of naming with a word or a short phrase our best guess of what's actually happening for the other person. It's not paraphrasing what they're saying. It's noticing something like the feeling that's going on. You're excited about that, huh? Some sadness coming up. Something's shifting for you. We're naming something that's happening that probably hasn't been spoken. And it serves many purposes. It lets the person know that we're following their present experience. It helps us test our guess about what's happening for them, so it doesn't land in the realm of making assumptions. And then we can shift our tracking if the person corrects us, for example, or even looks as if the contact statement hasn't landed. It's very skillful, for example, to say something like sadness. I think I see sadness. And the person looks a bit confused, and the next contact statement would be, not quite it, huh? Or something else. We want to let them know that we understand the experience they're having behind the words that they're sharing with us. Contact statements are a very normal way of communicating. If you sit in a coffee shop and listen to people's conversations, they're contacting each other all the time. Sometimes it is just a paraphrase, a repetition of a word the other person has said. And sometimes it's a really good naming of the person's experience. And yet, because it's a skill in Hakomi, sometimes when we're teaching it in the trainings, it's awkward for people, or they feel like they're interrupting the person when they're listening to actually make a verbal contact statement. So one of the ways that I teach contact statements is coming back to a mindfulness practice. We start with the entire group simply sitting in mindful awareness, noticing their own present experience. Each person is invited in silence at first to come up with a word in their mind to name what they're noticing going on for them. It might even be as simple as thinking. So it doesn't describe the whole thought, that's just what's happening, thinking, or shifting, or sighing, smiling, enjoying. There's a very different level of skillfulness to contact, even with oneself, smiling and enjoying. Enjoying is the experience behind the smile, perhaps. So we start with a whole group in silence, noticing themselves in present experience with a word like that in their own mind. And then I have people softly but audibly say the words out loud. So the room is filled with these words that are usually either gerunds, ing words, like shifting, smiling, or possibly adjectives like restless or tired. And just you hear the room full of these soft naming words, naming present experience. And the next level of the practice is to have people sit in pairs. One person in mindful awareness and the other person is simply a silent witness. And the mindful person, again, is just naming their own experience softly with a word or a short phrase while they're being witnessed by their partner in silence. And they're actually contacting their own experience as they do that. And the most advanced part of that practice is at one point for the witness to take over naming the mindful person's experience. So the witness is now following up with the mindful person is silent now, and the witness continues to come up with, from time to time, a word or a phrase that names their best guess of the mindful person's present experience. The first time I had people do that naming practice, I call it, in mindfulness, where someone is naming their own present moment experience with a witness, and then the witness gradually takes over naming, which ultimately teaches them about contact statements. There was a surprising result for me. Yes, they got much more comfortable and fluent with contacting themselves and each other. But the amazing thing that happened for me was it was without ever mentioning the phrase loving presence. The two people involved in that practice became spontaneously in loving presence with each other. It's just the most predictably consistent way of inviting people to experience loving presence is to have them connected in that wonderful resonant, limbic resonance way with contact. One of the reasons that we use contact in the beginning of working with somebody is to develop the relationship, is to let them know that we're following their present experience, we're on the same page. It's a very good, very general, skillful communication tool. And I teach it to lots of people besides therapists, to people in relationship that are needing to demonstrate listening, parents listening to children, just anybody that wants to be able to be more skillful as a listener. So in the first stage of a Hakomi session, for example, we might use contact statements, certainly instead of questions, because it demonstrates to the person very quickly that we're interested, that we're following, that we're non-judgmental. The way we contact lets them know all of that we're listening and that we're welcoming whatever they're telling us and that we're following the experience behind the words, that we're following the storyteller, not just the story. So the contact statements are important at the very beginning of the session, but they're also important to continue with throughout the session, although we may need to use more with some people than with others, and sometimes people will actually require almost no verbal contact, just a sense that we're present with them, that we're present in a way that's non-judgmental and that follows their present experience. And yet other people will need to hear that verbal contact more frequently and probably throughout the whole session. It's important as a way of demonstrating that we're following what they've come in with, how things change throughout the session, their responses to the interventions we make, to the little experiences and experiments we do in mindfulness, and particularly at the end, so there's a sense of anchoring and being on the same page about how they feel at the end of the session. Contact is important throughout. Sometimes